My family forced me to marry a dead man, and what I discovered afterward changed everything I believed about the people who claimed to love me. Good morning, my dears. It's me, Layla Matthews. I'm 91 years old, and today I'm going to tell you a story that I've kept in my heart for decades. A story that begins with a dream and ends with a revelation that no one could have imagined. Before I start, I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me continue sharing my stories with you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who the kind souls are that dedicate their time to listening to the memories of an old lady like me. The year was 1954. I was only 18 years old and lived with my family on a small property in rural Kentucky near the Appalachian region. Our life was simple, not to say impoverished. My father, Mr. Joseph Matthews, was a hard-working man who cultivated a small piece of land. My mother, Mrs. Margaret Matthews, took care of me and my 4 younger siblings. That year, a terrible drought devastated our region. The crops died, the animals got sick, and to complete our misfortune, my father contracted a fever that left him bedridden for weeks. The doctor from town said he needed expensive medicine, and our family sank into debt with the general store, the pharmacy, neighbors, with anyone who could lend us money to survive. I saw desperation in my mother's eyes every morning, saw how she hid her tears while preparing a thin porridge that had to feed 7 mouths, saw how my father withered a little more each day, not only from illness, but from the shame of not being able to support his family. I remember it as if it were yesterday. It was a Tuesday, the sun was already setting. I was returning from the river where I had gone to wash clothes for a wealthy family in town, one of the many jobs I did to try to bring home a few coins. Upon arrival, I noticed something different. My parents were sitting at the kitchen table, and for the first time in months, they were smiling. "Layla, come here, child," called my mother with an expression that mixed relief and a strange anxiety. I sat with them, exhausted from the nearly 2-hour walk from the river to our house, carrying bundles of wet clothes. "God has heard our prayers, my daughter," said my father, his voice weak but with a sparkle in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. Mr. Montgomery, owner of the largest lands in the region, was here today. My eyes widened. The Montgomerys were practically legends in our region, owners of farms, businesses, and they even said they had influence in the state capital's politics. They rarely left their mansion on the hill, and when they did, it was in gleaming automobiles, leaving a cloud of dust wherever they went. "And what did he want with us?" I asked, unable to imagine what such a powerful man would be doing in our humble home. My mother held my hands on the table. Her hands were calloused from so much work, but at that moment they trembled with emotion. "Daughter, his son, Isaac Montgomery, has asked for your hand in marriage." I was speechless. Isaac Montgomery, the man everyone in town spoke of with reverence. They said he had studied in New York City, that he spoke foreign languages, that he wore fine clothes imported from Europe. How could he want to marry me, a simple country girl who barely knew how to read and write? "But I've never even seen him," I stammered in confusion. "He saw you, my daughter," replied my mother, "at the Easter service. He told his father he was enchanted by your modesty and beauty, and old Montgomery came personally to ask for your hand. And there's more," continued my father, leaning forward with difficulty. "He paid all our debts, all of them, daughter, and promised that we will be able to keep our farm and even receive monthly help after you're married." My eyes filled with tears. I didn't know if from joy, surprise, or fear. It was all so sudden, so unexpected. Marrying a man I had never talked to, whom I knew only from stories told by others. "But father, mother, I don't even know him. How can I marry like this?" "Daughter," my mother squeezed my hands tightly, "you know how we're suffering. Your father needs treatment. Your siblings need to eat. This is a blessing we cannot refuse." I looked at my little brothers and sisters playing in the corner of the room, unaware of the conversation that was deciding my fate. The youngest, Tommy, was only 4 years old and was so thin that his ribs showed under his patched shirt. And when When would this happen? I asked, my voice faltering. In 10 days, replied my father, on July 10th. First, you'll meet him at the Montgomery house, and then the preparations for the wedding will begin. That night, lying on the mat I shared with my 2 sisters, I couldn't sleep. On one hand, I felt afraid of the unknown, of marrying a stranger, of leaving my family. On the other, I dreamed of the possibility of a better life, not just for me, but for everyone I loved. In the days that followed, our house turned into a celebration. Neighbors who had previously avoided us because of our debts now appeared with gifts and smiles, wanting to be close to the future Mrs. Montgomery. My mother and my aunts began to prepare the best dress they could with the few fabrics we had. A cousin, who worked as a maid for a rich family, brought secretly a bit of French perfume that her employer had discarded. My father visibly improved with the medicines we could now afford. The color returned to his face, and he was even able to get up for meals. My siblings finally had enough to eat, and their laughter filled the house again. And I lived between dream and fear. I tried to imagine what Isaac Montgomery would be like up close. Would he be kind, loving? Would he respect a simple girl like me? Sometimes I caught myself smiling alone, imagining a beautiful house, healthy and well-fed children, visits to my parents bringing presents for my siblings. Other times, I woke up in the middle of the night in panic. What if he was cruel? What if he treated me like a servant? Or worse, what if he regretted it when seeing me up close, realizing I wasn't what he expected? My mother noticed my doubts. One afternoon, while we were washing clothes together in the house tub, she approached and fixed a strand of my hair. "Daughter, I know you're afraid, it's natural, but remember that this is an opportunity that God has placed in our path. The Montgomerys could choose any girl in town, daughters of merchants, of farmers, but they chose you. There must be something special they saw in you." Her words comforted me a little, but the anxiety remained. On July 9th, the eve of the big meeting, I received a letter. The messenger was a well-dressed young man, mounted on an impressive horse. He said he worked for the Montgomerys and had been sent especially to deliver that correspondence to me. With trembling hands, I opened the scented envelope. Inside, on a fine paper that I had never touched before, was written in elegant handwriting, "Miss Layla, I can hardly wait to finally meet you in person tomorrow. Know that from the moment I saw you in church, your face has not left my thoughts. I promise to do everything to be a good husband and to ensure that your family never lacks for anything. Until tomorrow, Isaac Montgomery." That letter was like a balm for my troubled heart. The words were kind, respectful. Maybe everything would work out after all. I showed the letter to my mother, who cried with emotion. My father read it aloud to the neighbors who came to visit, as proud as I had ever seen him. The morning of July 10th dawned with a blue sky without clouds, like a promise of better days. I dressed with the greatest care. The dress that my aunts had sewn was simple, but the most beautiful I had ever worn. It was light blue, with small details embroidered on the neckline. My mother combed my long black hair and tied it with a ribbon that she had kept from her own wedding. "You look beautiful, my daughter," she said with tears in her eyes. "You will capture his heart once and for all." At noon, a black and gleaming automobile stopped in front of our house. The driver, a middle-aged man wearing an impeccable uniform, got out and announced that he had come to pick me up for the meeting with my future fiancé. My heart was beating so hard, I thought everyone could hear it. I hugged my parents and siblings, promised I would return soon to tell all the details, and entered the most luxurious automobile I had ever seen in my life. During the journey to the Montgomery mansion, I observed the familiar landscapes of my town through the window with new eyes, the small houses, the stores, the church. Everything seemed smaller now, as if I were already saying goodbye to that world. When we finally arrived at the Montgomery property, I was breathless. The mansion was even more imposing than they said. A 2-story building with columns at the entrance, surrounded by immaculately maintained gardens. Uniformed employees walked hurriedly along the stone paths. The driver led me to the entrance, where an elegant woman awaited me. It was Mrs. Esther Montgomery, my future mother-in-law. Tall, thin, with impeccably arranged gray hair and wearing jewelry that sparkled in the sun, she analyzed me from top to bottom when I got out of the car. "So you are Layla," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to our home. Isaac is anxious to see you." I swallowed hard and thanked her with a thin voice. Mrs. Esther led me through an entrance hall with marble flooring decorated with furniture that seemed to have come out of a palace. Huge paintings covered the walls, depicting people I imagined to be ancestors of the Montgomerys. We walked down a long corridor, our steps echoing in the silence. With each step, my heart accelerated more. Finally, we stopped in front of a dark wooden double door. "My dear," said Mrs. Esther with a voice that suddenly seemed strangely solemn. "It's time to meet Isaac. He is resting, but waiting for you." That pause caused me a chill, but I attributed it to my own nervousness. Mrs. Esther opened the doors and invited me to enter. The room was dark, with heavy curtains almost completely closed. Only a few candles illuminated the environment, creating dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was something that at first I couldn't distinguish. When my eyes adjusted to the dim light, my blood froze. There, on a table covered with a black cloth, was an open coffin, and inside it, my knees weakened and the world began to spin around me. Inside the coffin, dressed in an impeccable suit and with hands crossed over his chest, was a man, a dead man. "Isaac is waiting for his bride," said Mrs. Esther behind me, her voice now cold as ice. "Won't you greet your future husband?" And it was at that moment that I understood. The man I was going to marry was already dead. I don't know how long I stood there paralyzed, looking at the lifeless body of Isaac Montgomery. My thoughts jumbled as I tried to understand what was happening. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet, and everything went dark. When I regained my senses, I was lying on a sofa in another room in the mansion. Mrs. Esther was sitting near me, along with an elderly man, who I later discovered was Colonel Montgomery, Isaac's father. I tried to get up, but my body seemed made of lead. "Calm down, girl," said Colonel Montgomery. His voice was as rough as gravel. "I know you must be frightened, but everything has an explanation." Tears ran down my face as I stammered disconnected questions. How? Why? What was happening? "Isaac passed away 3 days ago," explained the colonel coldly. "A sudden fever took him. But the arrangements for your wedding were already made, the documents prepared, the agreements established." "But how can I marry someone who is already gone?" I asked between sobs. The old Montgomery exchanged a look with his wife before continuing. "The wedding will happen as planned. It's important for our family to maintain certain traditions and to honor my son's last wish." "Last wish?" I repeated, confused. "Yes," intervened Mrs. Esther. "When Isaac realized he wouldn't survive the fever, he made us promise that the wedding would happen in any case. He really was enchanted by you, girl, and wanted to ensure that you and your family would be protected even after his departure." That made no sense. How could a man who had never talked to me make such a request on his deathbed? But I was too stunned to question the logic of that story. "And my parents?" I asked. "Do they know about this?" "No," replied the colonel, "and they don't need to know for now. Tomorrow, after the ceremony, you can visit them and tell them that Isaac fell gravely ill right after the wedding. In a few weeks, we will announce his death. That way, it will be less shocking." My head was spinning. This was madness. How could they expect me to participate in such a farce? "I can't do this," I said, trying to stand up. "I need to go home. My parents must be worried." Colonel Montgomery held my arm with surprising strength for a man of his age. His eyes, previously indifferent, now burned with an intensity that made me freeze. "Listen well, girl. Your family now owes more than $10,000 to me. Money that I paid to save your father, feed your siblings, secure your roof. If you refuse this arrangement, I will not only demand every cent immediately, but I will make sure your father never finds work in this county again. Understood? My entire body was trembling. I knew well the influence of the Montgomerys. If they wanted, they could destroy my family. Dad was still weak. Mom couldn't support everyone alone, and my siblings were still too young. Please, I begged, at least let me talk to my parents, explain what happened. Impossible, cut off Mrs. Esther. The ceremony will be at midnight. Afterwards, when everything is resolved, you can visit them briefly, under our supervision. The hours that followed were a blur of horror and despair. I was taken to a room where two silent maids helped me dress in a black bridal outfit, as if I were already in mourning. My hair was tied in a severe bun, covered by a black veil. While they prepared me, I cried silently, begging God to wake me from that nightmare. But it wasn't a dream, it was real, terribly real. At midnight, as promised, I was led to the private chapel on the property. It was a small, ancient building, illuminated only by candles that projected dancing shadows on the stone walls. At the altar, Isaac's coffin was already positioned, open, displaying its occupant as in a morbid exposition. An elderly and trembling priest awaited with an indecipherable expression. Around, only about a dozen people, presumably relatives of the Montgomerys, all with faces and gazes that avoided mine. The ceremony was short and surreal. I vaguely remember repeating words they told me to say, of a ring being placed on my finger. I remember the sweet and nauseating odor that emanated from the coffin, the serene and artificial expression of the dead man they now called my husband. At some point, the priest declared us husband and wife. There was a brief silence, and then Colonel Montgomery approached me. "Now you are Layla Montgomery," he said in a low voice. "A respectable widow who will have everything she needs as long as she honors our agreement and keeps up appearances." After the macabre ceremony, I was led to a room at the back of the mansion. It was a simple room compared to the rest of the house, but still more luxurious than any place I had ever slept. There was a canopied bed, a dark wood wardrobe, a dressing table with an oval mirror, and a small window that overlooked the back garden. "This will be your room," informed Mrs. Esther. "Tomorrow, we will discuss your responsibilities as the widow of my son." She left, locking the door from the outside. I was left alone with my despair, crying until I had no more tears, praying until the words lost meaning. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale face of Isaac Montgomery, smelled the odor of the coffin, heard the threatening words of the colonel. The next morning, Mrs. Esther entered the room with two maids who carried a tray with breakfast and several pieces of black clothing. "From today on, you will wear only mourning clothes," she declared, "as is appropriate for a widow. This afternoon, we will allow you to briefly visit your parents to explain the situation as we agreed. You will say that you married Isaac yesterday and that today he woke up very sick with the same fever that had been afflicting him for days." For how long will I need to lie?" I asked, my voice hoarse from so much crying. "2 weeks will be sufficient. Then we will officially announce my son's death. You will continue living here as his widow, receive a small allowance, and we will ensure that your family continues receiving assistance as promised." That afternoon, as promised, I was taken to my parents' house. Colonel Montgomery made a point of accompanying me to ensure I would follow the agreed script. The happiness on my parents' faces, when they opened the door for me, quickly turned to concern when they noticed my dark clothes and my worn face. Before they could ask questions, the colonel spoke up, explaining that his son had fallen gravely ill right after the wedding ceremony. "It's a mysterious fever," he said with false sadness. "The doctors are doing their best, but I fear the worst." I brought Layla for a brief visit, as she was very anxious to see her family. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering words of comfort. My father shook the colonel's hand, thanking him for taking care of me and offering prayers for Isaac's recovery. My little siblings surrounded me, showing me the small presents they had bought with the money they now had. A new top, a mended dress, notebooks for school. It was the most painful visit of my life. Every hopeful smile, every word of gratitude was like a knife in my chest. I was betraying the trust of the people I loved most, participating in a cruel lie. But what choice did I have? During the visit, I noticed how my father seemed healthier, how the house now had food in the pantry, how my siblings looked cleaner and better fed. The price of their security was my freedom, and at that moment, I decided I would pay that price, however high it might be. 2 weeks later, as promised, the news of Isaac Montgomery's death was announced. There was a large public funeral with the coffin now closed due to the progression of the disease, they explained. The entire town came to pay their condolences. I was there, dressed in black from head to toe, playing the role of the inconsolable widow. My parents and siblings cried at the loss of a son-in-law and brother-in-law they had barely known. They embraced me, offering comfort, saying I could return home if I wanted. But Colonel Montgomery quickly intervened, informing everyone that I would remain in the mansion, as was appropriate for the widow of his only son. "She will be like a daughter to us now," he said with a smile that only I knew was false. "We will take care of her as Isaac would have wanted." And so began my life as the Montgomery widow. I was 18 years old, had never been truly married, and now was trapped in a farce I didn't completely understand. I was a prisoner in a golden cage, living with people who treated me sometimes with indifference, sometimes with poorly disguised contempt. My days followed a rigid and lonely routine. I woke early, had breakfast alone in my room, then spent hours in the mansion's library, where I tried to improve my reading, one of the few activities allowed to me. Sometimes, when Mrs. Esther traveled, which happened frequently, I discreetly explored the less visited corners of the house, always alert not to be discovered. I was permitted to visit my family once a month, always accompanied by a trusted employee of the Montgomerys. These visits were my only consolation, my only connection to the life I had left behind. As the months passed, I noticed strange behaviors in the mansion. Unknown men arrived for secret meetings with the colonel. Documents were quickly hidden when I entered a room. Conversations were abruptly interrupted in my presence. Something obscure was happening in that house, something that went beyond the farce of my marriage. One night, almost 6 months after my arrival at the mansion, I heard a heated discussion coming from the colonel's office. It wasn't my habit to listen behind doors, but something in the urgency of the voices attracted me. "The documents need to be renewed," said an unknown voice. "His signature won't serve us forever." "That's why we arranged the girl," replied the colonel. "Her signature as a widow is almost as good as his." "And she doesn't suspect anything?" "She's an ignorant country girl," replied the colonel with a bitter laugh. "She thinks we're doing all this because of family tradition. As long as her family continues receiving money, she'll continue obeying." I moved away from the door, my heart beating uncontrollably. What did that mean? What documents? Why was my signature so important? That night, lying in my bed, I began to realize that there was much more to this story than a simple posthumous marriage. Something dark was hiding behind the walls of that mansion. Something that involved money, power, and secrets. And I, without knowing, had become a fundamental piece in this shadowy game. That's when I decided that if I was condemned to live in that golden prison, at least I would discover the truth. I needed to understand why the Montgomerys had chosen me, why they had insisted so much on marrying me to a man who was already dead, and perhaps find in that truth a way to recover my freedom. What I didn't know was that the truth would be even more shocking and disturbing than I could have imagined, and that upon discovering it, my life would change forever. Once again, life in the Montgomery mansion followed its somber course. I had turned 19 in silence, without celebrations, just with a letter and a small package sent by my mother, which the butler delivered to me with evident disdain. It had been almost a year since I had been living in that farce, playing the role of widow to a man I had never known in life. With the passing of the months, I became practically invisible in that house. The employees barely spoke to me. Mrs. Esther traveled more and more, and Colonel Montgomery rarely called for me, except when he needed me to sign some document. This relative freedom within the walls of the mansion allowed me to observe and learn. I learned to move silently through the corridors. I learned which floorboards creaked and should be avoided. I learned the schedules when each room was empty, the routines of the employees, the habits of the colonel. More importantly, I learned to read better using the books from the library, a skill that my poor education had only begun. On January 5, 1955, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Esther, who had returned from one of her mysterious trips the night before, summoned me to the main office of the mansion. It was the first time I had been called to that room, the private sanctuary of Colonel Montgomery. "Layla," she said, without even raising her eyes from the papers she was organizing. "We need you to attend an event in the state capitol next month. Some business associates of the family need to meet Isaac's widow." That surprised me. In almost a year, they had never allowed me to leave town. Why now? "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice firm, hiding the agitation I felt inside. "Don't question, just obey," replied Mrs. Esther coldly. "A dressmaker will come tomorrow to prepare appropriate clothes. Remember what is at stake. Your family's well-being depends on your cooperation." I left the office with a buzzing mind. Why, after keeping me hidden for so long, did they want to display me publicly? What was changing? As I returned to my room, I noticed that the door to the room that served as the family archive was ajar, something unusual, as that door normally remained locked. I looked around to confirm that I was alone in the corridor, and in an impulse of courage, slipped inside. The room was full of shelves and files. The weak light that entered through the window, covered by heavy curtains, barely illuminated the documents. I knew I didn't have much time before someone noticed the open door or my absence. So I moved quickly, examining the most accessible papers. That's when a familiar name caught my attention. In a folder left open on the central table, I saw the name Isaac Montgomery on a document that seemed official. My heart raced as I approached to read better. It was a death certificate. It wouldn't be strange, except for one detail that made my blood freeze: the date. According to that document, Isaac Montgomery had died on February 22, 1949, more than 5 years before our supposed marriage. My hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the paper. How was that possible? Who then had I married in that macabre ceremony? I heard footsteps in the corridor and quickly put the document back in the folder, exactly as it was. I slipped out of the room and ran to my bedroom, my heart beating like a drum in my chest. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind spun with unanswered questions. If Isaac had died years before, who was the man in the coffin? Why did the Montgomerys need a false widow? Why me? In the days that followed, I observed the house and its occupants with new eyes. Each movement, each word gained a new meaning. I realized I was at the center of a much larger and more complex scheme than I had ever imagined. A week after the discovery, I had an idea. During my monthly visit to my family, I asked my mother to lend me an object of sentimental value, a small crucifix that had belonged to my grandmother. I explained that I wanted to have it with me to feel closer to them. She agreed, without suspecting I had other plans. Back at the mansion, I used the crucifix as an excuse for something more risky. I approached Mrs. Esther, who had returned from another trip. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my eyes low in a sign of respect, "I would like to visit my husband's grave to pray for his soul. I brought this family crucifix to leave with him." Mrs. Esther studied me for a moment, her cold eyes assessing my intentions. "I see no need for that," she replied dryly. "Your prayers can be made from anywhere." "Please," I insisted, feigning emotion. "It's been almost a year, and I haven't been able to pay my respects properly. As his widow, it's my duty." Perhaps it was the mention of the time past that convinced her. Or perhaps she just wanted to avoid raising suspicions by denying such a reasonable request. After a long silence, she nodded. "Very well. Tomorrow morning, Sebastian will take you to the cemetery. You'll have half an hour, no more." Sebastian was the driver, a taciturn man who rarely spoke, but whom I suspected was more observant than he showed. The next day, as agreed, he drove me to the municipal cemetery in complete silence. The cemetery was large and well-maintained, with tombs that reflected the same social division as the town, sumptuous mausoleums of rich families in the central area, and simple graves on the edges. Sebastian led me directly to the Montgomery family mausoleum, an imposing marble construction with carved angels guarding the entrance. "I'll wait here outside," he said, his first comment since we had left the mansion. "Don't delay." I entered the mausoleum with a racing heart. The interior was cold and silent, with marble plaques on the walls indicating the names of the deceased. I quickly went through them until finding the one I was looking for. Isaac Montgomery, 1920–1949. There it was, in marble and gold, the confirmation of what I had seen in the document. The real Isaac Montgomery had indeed died 5 years before our fake wedding. I observed the date more carefully. Deceased on February 22, 1949, in New York City. So he really had studied there, as the story said. But what had happened? I examined the plaque for more information, but there were no details about the cause of death. Beside the plaque was a framed photograph. I approached to better see the face of the man I had supposedly married. He was a young man with delicate features, with light eyes and a serious expression. Nothing like the corpse in the coffin during our wedding ceremony. I left the mausoleum deeply shaken, but determined to unravel this mystery. Sebastian observed me with curiosity when I returned before the agreed time, but didn't ask questions. Back at the mansion, I concentrated my efforts on finding more clues. The visit to the capital, mentioned by Mrs. Esther, would be in 2 weeks, and I had the feeling it was related to the Montgomery's scheme. One afternoon, when I knew the Colonel would be away at one of his meetings in town and Mrs. Esther was resting in her quarters after lunch, I risked exploring the archive room again. This time, I went straight to the drawers marked with the years 1949 and 1950, looking for any document related to Isaac's death. In a yellowed folder, I found newspaper clippings from New York City. One of them briefly reported the death of a young law student, son of an influential family from the interior, in an automobile accident. The name wasn't mentioned in the clipping I was holding, but the date coincided. I kept searching and found something even more revealing. A letter from a lawyer in New York City addressed to Colonel Montgomery, dated March 1949. The letter mentioned the regrettable accident and discussed the legal procedures for the transfer of properties and investments that were in Isaac's name. One paragraph in particular caught my attention. As we discussed, the absence of a direct heir significantly complicates the situation. The third-degree cousins from the maternal family could contest the will if they learn of the existence of the assets in New York. I recommend proceeding as per our previous conversation to prevent the properties from leaving the family's control. That letter began to clarify the puzzle. Without direct heirs, part of Isaac's fortune could pass to distant relatives. The Montgomerys were trying to avoid this at all costs, but it still didn't explain why they needed me or why they maintained the farce that Isaac was alive for so long after his death. The answer came a few days later, when I found a semi-hidden document in an accounting book in the library, a place I frequented regularly without raising suspicions. It was a legal agreement, complex, that mentioned various properties and investments that generated substantial income. The document had a specific clause that made everything make sense. The aforementioned properties and investments will remain under the exclusive administration of the holder until his death, when they will pass entirely to his spouse, or, in the absence thereof, will be divided among the legal heirs, as established in the Civil Code. Finally, I understood. Isaac's most valuable properties and investments had a special condition. They could only remain entirely with the Montgomery family if he had a spouse. Without a wife, the assets would be divided among other heirs. The Montgomerys had kept Isaac's death a secret for years, probably forging his signature on documents to continue controlling his properties. But this strategy had limits. At some point, Isaac's physical absence would raise suspicions, They needed a more permanent solution. And that solution was me, an official widow, legally documented, who could sign papers and represent their interests without questioning. A poor girl without formal education, grateful for the financial help to her family, who wouldn't understand the legal aspects of what was happening. The scheme was as cruel as it was brilliant. They never needed a marriage, they needed a widow. And to have a legitimate widow, they needed a documented marriage, even if with a corpse. On January 20th, 1955, I found the final confirmation of my suspicions. Mrs. Esther had gone out for preparations for the trip, and the Colonel was at his farm on the outskirts of town. With the house practically empty, I risked entering the main office. In a locked drawer that I managed to open with a hairpin, a skill I learned by secretly observing one of the employees, I found a complete dossier on me. There were detailed notes about how they found me, why they chose me, and plans for the future. A handwritten note from the Colonel said, "The girl Layla is perfect, large and indebted family, no influential connections, minimal education, presentable appearance for social events when necessary. Her signature as Isaac's widow will give us legal control over the New York assets for at least 2 more decades if we manage the situation properly." Another more recent note mentioned the imminent trip, necessary to present the widow to the New York partners. 5 years is enough time that no one will question discrepancies in appearance or behavior in relation to the real Isaac. At that moment, sitting in the office of the man who had so cruelly manipulated my life, I made a decision. I would no longer be a piece in the Montgomerys' game. I would find a way to escape and expose the truth, but I needed to be cautious. One false move could not only ruin my chances, but also put my family in danger. I needed a careful plan, and above all, evidence I could take with me. The trip to New York City would be in 10 days. It would be my only chance to escape the Montgomerys' control, and finally, reclaim my freedom. Methodically and carefully, I began to prepare my escape, knowing I would face the greatest challenge of my young life. That night, as I mentally organized my next steps, I looked at my grandmother's crucifix and made a silent promise. The farce of the Montgomery widow would come to an end, and the real Layla would finally begin to live. The 10 days leading up to the trip to New York City were the longest and tensest of my life. Every minute was a battle between the fear of being discovered and the determination to execute my plan. While Mrs. Esther personally supervised the fittings of my wardrobe for the trip, elegant but discreet morning dresses, I observed every detail of the house routine, every schedule, every habit. At night, when everyone was asleep, I worked silently in my room, using a small blade I had pilfered from the kitchen. I carefully undid the hem of one of my simplest dresses, creating a secret compartment where I hid the most important documents I had found. Isaac's original death certificate, newspaper clippings about his death, and the incriminating letter detailing the Montgomerys' plan. I also needed money. Without resources, my escape would be short-lived and unsuccessful. Luckily, I discovered that Mrs. Esther kept a small amount in her desk for household expenses. Over several days, I subtracted small amounts, not enough to be noticed immediately, but which added together would give me some survival time. The hardest part was thinking about my family. I knew that once I disappeared, the Montgomerys would probably cut off financial aid to my parents. This idea tormented me, but I also understood that remaining in that farce would mean a lifetime of servitude. If I managed to expose the truth and obtain justice, perhaps I could help them in another way. On the eve of the trip, when preparations were almost complete, I asked permission to visit my family one last time before departing. Surprisingly, the Colonel agreed, perhaps to maintain the appearance of normality. "Just remember," he warned as I left, "not a word about the real destination of the trip. Just say you're visiting distant relatives of Isaac to resolve inheritance matters." That visit was especially painful. My parents were so proud of me. The daughter who had married a rich man, and even after his tragic death, continued being respected by his family. My mother cried as she hugged me, saying how elegant I looked in my fine clothes, even if they were mourning ones. My father, now fully recovered from his illness, showed me the improvements he had made to the house with the Montgomerys' money. My siblings, all in school now, animatedly told me about their studies. The youngest, Tommy, who barely spoke when I left, now ran around the house reciting the numbers he had learned. It was a scene of simple prosperity, a happiness that I had helped provide with my sacrifice. How could I tell them that everything had been built on a lie? How could I explain that soon this security might disappear? I couldn't. Instead, I hugged each one long, keeping their faces in my memory, praying they would forgive me when they knew the truth. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," I lied, hating myself for it, but knowing it was necessary. "Take care. I love you all more than anything." On the morning of January 25th, 1955, we left for the capital. We were a small group, myself, Mrs. Esther, Colonel Montgomery, and 2 trusted employees. The train journey was silent and tense. I watched through the window as the landscapes of my native land disappeared, feeling a mixture of fear and hope for the unknown that awaited me. New York City was more impressive than anything I could have imagined. The tall buildings, the busy streets, the immense cityscape. Everything seemed from another world for a country girl like me. We went directly to an elegant hotel where we occupied an entire suite. For the first time, I was publicly presented as Mrs. Layla Montgomery, widow of our dear Isaac. The meeting with the partners was scheduled for the next day. That night, while Mrs. Esther and the Colonel dined in the hotel restaurant, I asked to stay in the room, claiming a strong headache. It was the moment I had been waiting for. As soon as I was alone, I changed from the morning dress to a simpler, more discreet one that I had hidden in my luggage. I put the money and documents in a small purse. I hesitated for a moment before the mirror. I was about to leap into the unknown in a huge city I had never known. But the face that stared back at me in the reflection was no longer that of the naive 18-year-old girl, but of a woman determined to reclaim her life. I left through the hotel's back door, quickly blending with the crowd in the streets. My first objective was to find the nearest police station and report everything. But after walking a few blocks, I reconsidered. The Montgomerys were powerful. Who would believe me? A country girl without connections against one of the most influential families in the state. I needed help, someone with enough authority to confront the Montgomerys. It was then that I remembered a name I had seen in the documents, Dr. Augustus Lawson, a lawyer who had questioned some of the Colonel's businesses. His office was in the city center. Using almost all the money I had brought, I took a taxi to the address. It was almost night when I arrived at the imposing building. The office would be closed, but I had nowhere to spend the night and feared the Montgomerys might already be looking for me. By luck, or perhaps divine providence, when I arrived at the building, a middle-aged gentleman was leaving. I recognized him immediately from the descriptions in the documents. It was Dr. Lawson himself. "Dr. Lawson?" I called, approaching nervously. "Please, I need to speak with you." "It's about the Montgomery family and Isaac Montgomery." He looked at me with surprise and caution. "And who might you be, miss?" "My name is Layla Matthews, although they force me to use the name Montgomery. I am supposedly the wife of Isaac Montgomery." His expression changed from caution to shock. "That's impossible. Isaac Montgomery died almost 6 years ago." "I know," I replied, pulling the documents from my purse. "And I have evidence of all the fraud that the Montgomerys planned using my name." Dr. Lawson studied me for a moment, then checked his watch. "Come into my office, Ms. Matthews. I think we have much to discuss." That night, in a small room illuminated only by the light of a lamp, I told my entire story to the lawyer. I showed each document, each piece of evidence I had collected during my months of silent investigation. I explained how I had been forced to participate in the farce, how I discovered the truth, how I planned my escape. Dr. Lawson listened to everything with professional attention, making occasional notes, examining each document carefully. When I finished, it was already past midnight. "Ms. Matthews," he said finally, "what you've brought me is evidence of an elaborate fraud and several serious crimes. Forgery of documents, coercion, possible embezzlement, among others. But I need to be honest. Confronting the Montgomerys won't be easy. They have connections at all levels of government and the judiciary." "I'm aware of the risks," I replied, "but I cannot continue living in this lie." "I understand. I will help you, but we will need to act with extreme caution. For now, you cannot return to the hotel. The Montgomerys have certainly noticed your disappearance and must be looking for you." Dr. Lawson arranged for me to stay in a discreet boarding house, run by a trusted widow. In the days that followed, while local newspapers discreetly reported the disappearance of the young Montgomery widow, he worked tirelessly, preparing the case. A week later, when we received news that the Montgomerys had returned to the interior after fruitless searches, Dr. Lawson formally filed a complaint with the district attorney's office. The case was too complex to be ignored, even with the Montgomerys' influence. What followed were months of testimonies, investigations, and veiled threats. The Montgomerys, as expected, denied everything, claiming I was a young woman disturbed by her husband's death, who had invented fanciful stories. They tried to disqualify me in every possible way. They said I had mental problems, that I had stolen documents, that I was being manipulated by enemies of the family. The hardest blow came when I learned that, as I feared, they had cut off all assistance to my family. My father, without resources to maintain the improvements on the farm, was forced to sell part of the land. My siblings had to leave school to work. The news shattered me, but also strengthened my resolve. I couldn't give up now. Dr. Lawson, noticing my despair, offered me a small job in his office. I had no experience in administrative work, but I learned quickly. My handwriting, which had improved greatly during my months in the Montgomerys' library, became a valuable asset for copying legal documents. In August 1955, after months of legal battles, we obtained our first significant victory. A federal judge, known for his integrity, ordered the opening of a formal investigation into Isaac Montgomery's properties and the legitimacy of documents signed after his death. It was the first step to dismantle the Montgomerys' fraudulent empire, but the process would be long. During this time, I lived modestly in New York City, working in Dr. Lawson's office and studying at night. He noticed my intelligence and thirst for knowledge and encouraged me to complete my formal education. "The best revenge against those who tried to use you," he said, "is to become someone they never imagined you could be." In January 1956, when the investigation began to reveal the extent of the Montgomerys' frauds, I was finally able to bring my family to New York City. The reunion was marked by tears and painful explanations. My parents were shocked to learn the whole truth, but to my relief, they didn't blame me. They understood that I too had been a victim, trying to protect them in the only way I could. My father found work in a factory, and my mother began to do sewing to supplement the income. My siblings returned to school. We rented a small apartment in a simple but honest neighborhood. It wasn't the life of comfort they had briefly known thanks to the Montgomerys' money, but it was a life based on truth and dignity. In March of that year, the newspapers printed the news we had been waiting for. Montgomery family under investigation for fraud and forgery. The Colonel and Mrs. Esther were indicted along with several accomplices. Their assets were frozen by the court. The legal battle would drag on for 3 more years, but the Montgomerys' empire was already crumbling. One by one, their associates began making deals with the prosecution, revealing more details of the scheme. We discovered that I hadn't been the first widow. There had been at least one previous attempt with another girl, who mysteriously fell ill and died a few months after the wedding. In December 1959, Colonel Montgomery was finally sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud, forgery, and other crimes. Mrs. Esther received a lesser sentence but also went to prison. The court determined that part of the fraudulently maintained properties should be returned to Isaac's true heirs, and another part sold to compensate the victims of the frauds, including my family. When the verdict was read, I was in law school. A dream I never imagined possible for a poor country girl. With Dr. Lawson's help, who had become a mentor and friend, I got a scholarship and was determined to become a lawyer who would fight for vulnerable people like I had been. The compensation we received allowed us to buy a modest house and ensure education for my siblings. My father, who never fully recovered from the trauma and difficulties we faced, passed away in 1962. But at least he had the consolation of seeing that justice had been done and that his family was safe. As for me, I completed my law studies in 1963 at 27 years old. I was one of the few women in my class. On the day of my graduation, while receiving my diploma, I thought of the naive young woman who had entered that luxurious automobile in 1954, dreaming of a marriage that would change her life. That marriage really did change my life, but in ways no one could have predicted. That night, back at the small celebration in our house, I kept my diploma in a box along with another document, the annulment certificate of my marriage to Isaac Montgomery, which I had received years before. Legally, I had never been the Montgomery widow. I was finally just me, Layla Matthews, free, educated, and in control of my own destiny. Graduating in law was just the beginning of my true life. After years of being manipulated, I finally had the tools to fight not just for myself, but for other vulnerable people. On March 15, 1964, I opened my modest law office in a small room in the center of New York City. It wasn't luxurious, just a desk, a few chairs, and shelves for law books. But for me, it represented the greatest achievement of my life. In the first few months, clients were scarce. Who would entrust important cases to a woman lawyer, something still rare in those days? I accepted small jobs, simple consultations, anything that would allow me to gain experience and build a reputation. Nights were dedicated to studying cases similar to mine, cases of family fraud, forgeries, abuses of power. It was during this period that I met Mary Conception, a lady of almost 60 who timidly entered my office on a rainy day in July. Her story made my heart ache. She had worked for 30 years as a housekeeper for a wealthy family who had promised to leave her a small house in their will. When the employer died, the children kicked her out with nothing, claiming there was no such document. "No one wants to take my case, counselor," she said, wiping away tears. "They say it's the word of a maid against a respected family." I looked at that woman who, like me, had trusted in the promises of the powerful and made my decision. "I'll take your case, Mrs. Mary, and I won't give up until we get justice." For 6 months, I worked tirelessly, gathering witnesses, former employees, neighbors who had heard the deceased mention his desire to compensate Mary's loyalty. We faced postponements, intimidation attempts, offers of miserable settlements. We refused them all. In February 1965, when the judge ruled in Mary's favor, granting her not only the promised house, but also compensation for moral damages, I realized my true vocation. I would not just be a lawyer, but an advocate for those who, like me, had been victims of people who abused their power and position. Mary's case brought other clients, mainly women in vulnerable situations, true widows who were deceived by greedy relatives, wives who lost everything in unjust divorces, domestic workers exploited by abusive employers. Each victory brought more cases. Each case taught me more about the multiple forms of injustice that existed, especially against women. In 1967, I bought a larger house for my mother and my younger siblings, who were now all studying. The youngest, Tommy, was following in my footsteps in law school, to my immense pride. My mother, who had aged prematurely after so many difficulties, could finally rest in a comfortable and secure home. It was during this time that I reconnected with Robert Fields, a journalist who had covered the Montgomery case years before. He was researching for a book on major frauds in America, and wanted to include my story. I initially hesitated. I had worked so hard to leave behind the identity of the Montgomery widow, but Robert convinced me that sharing my experience could help other people recognize similar schemes. Our meetings to discuss the book turned into dinners, and the dinners into long walks along the streets of New York. At 32, I, who had sworn never to trust a man again after the Montgomerys' manipulation, found myself falling in love with this man with a gentle gaze and firm principles. On December 20th, 1968, we married in a simple ceremony, only with close family and friends. My mother cried throughout the celebration, this time tears of true joy. When we left the church as husband and wife, I felt that a cycle was closing. My first marriage had been a macabre farce, an entry into a period of darkness. This one was real, luminous, the beginning of a new phase. Robert's book, Marriages, Lies, and Inheritances, Great Frauds of the American Elite, was published in 1969 and included a detailed chapter on the Montgomery case. The book became a success, exposing similar schemes in other regions of the country. We received letters from readers, some reporting similar situations, others thanking us for the warning. In the same year, I discovered I was pregnant. On June 2, 1970, at 34 years old, I gave birth to our daughter Clara, a name chosen to represent the light that had entered our lives. When I held her in my arms for the first time, I made a silent promise. She would never know the type of despair and manipulation I had faced. She would grow up strong, independent, educated about her rights. Balancing motherhood with career was challenging, but Robert was always a present partner, sharing responsibilities in an era when this was rare. I temporarily reduced my cases, focusing only on the most important ones, often working from home while Clara slept. In 1975, when Clara was 5 years old, I received an invitation that would again change the course of my career. A women's rights defense organization invited me to join their legal team. The work involved not just representing women in individual cases, but also fighting for legislative changes that would better protect women's rights. I accepted the challenge and plunged into a new battle. We traveled across the country, documenting cases of abuse, organizing meetings with legislators, pressing for reforms. It was exhausting work, but deeply rewarding. With each new law passed, each right secured, I felt I was transforming my own trauma into something positive for other women. During these years, I maintained distant contact with my hometown. Occasionally, I received news about the Montgomerys. The colonel died in prison in 1972. Mrs. Esther, after serving her reduced sentence, ended her days in a simple house on the outskirts of the town, abandoned by former friends and associates. The mansion, where I lived as a prisoner, was sold to pay debts and compensation and later transformed into a county museum. In 1980, when I turned 44, I returned to my hometown for the first time since my escape, accompanied by Robert and Clara, now a curious and intelligent teenager. It was a visit loaded with emotions. The town had changed, grown, modernized. Few remembered the Montgomery case, and even fewer recognized in me the young woman who had disappeared decades ago. We visited the municipal cemetery, where the Montgomery family mausoleum remained, now in a state of abandonment. Before Isaac's plaque, the man I never knew, but who had so much influence in my life, I felt not anger, but a strange peace. He too had been, in a way, a victim, his death used as a tool in a cruel scheme. "Who was he, Mom?" asked Clara, observing the date on the tombstone. "Someone whose name was used to imprison me," I replied, "but who ironically ended up freeing me for the life I have today." In the decades that followed, I continued my work as a lawyer and activist, even as my hair began to whiten and wrinkles marked my face. Clara followed her own path, graduated in journalism like her father, married, gave me grandchildren who grew up hearing softened versions of my story appropriate for their ages. Robert and I grew old together, sharing a life of purpose and genuine love, something that the young Layla never imagined she would find after the traumatic experience with the Montgomerys. When he passed away in 2005, After almost 4 decades of companionship, I felt a deep pain, but different from that desperate anguish of my youth. It was a pain tempered by gratitude for the years shared, for the memories built, for the legacy we left. Today, at 91 years old, sitting in this chair, as I tell my story, I look back and see the long path traveled from that dark chapel where a terrified girl was forced to marry a corpse. I see the determined young woman who escaped with documents hidden in the hem of her dress. I see the persistent student who graduated in law against all odds. I see the passionate lawyer who fought for other women. I see the wife and mother who built a family based on true love and respect. All these women are me, Layla Matthews. Not the Montgomery widow, not the victim of a fraud, not the piece in a power game, just myself with my choices, my struggles, my achievements. My grandchildren sometimes ask me if I have regrets, if I would change anything in my journey. I tell them no. Each moment of pain strengthened me, each obstacle taught me, each victory redeemed me. Even that terrible night in the Montgomery's chapel, when I thought my life had ended, was actually the beginning of a journey that would lead me to discover a strength I didn't even know I possessed. If there is a lesson I would like to leave for you who are listening to me today, it is this. No matter how dark the night seems, no matter how impossible the situation appears, never give up on the possibility of rewriting your own story. I was forced to marry a dead man, but I refused to die with him. Instead, I chose to live, truly live with purpose, courage, and dignity. This is my story, not the one they tried to write for me, but the one I wrote myself, word by word, decision by decision, day by day. A story that began with a marriage to death, but that blossomed into a full, meaningful life, and above all, truly my own. My dears, if this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear a message of hope and overcoming, and tell me in the comments what most touched you in my story. I'll be back next week with more memories to share with you. Thank you very much for listening to me with so much kindness.